My name is Severina McGill. I teach at Jindal Global Law School, and this module is for the Pathshala UGC. This module will look at the Persons with Disabilities Equal Opportunities, Protection of Rights and Full Participation Act of 1995 and Rights of Persons with Disability Act 2016 as under national legislative frameworks. According to the World Health Organization, more than 15% of the global population, or more than 1 billion people, live with a disability, out of which 19.2% are women. Disability rates among women are higher than among men. There is also a socio-economic difference. 22.1% of women in lower income countries have a disability compared to 14.4% in higher income countries. In India, there are nearly 70 million persons with a disability. Disability is an outcome from multiple reasons ranging from malnutrition, disease, war, accidents and age. Developing countries have the maximum number of persons with a disability. From here on, we'll call them persons with disabilities, and the stigma attached to disability as an outcome of negative social and cultural norms contributes to the multi-layered forms of discrimination that people with disabilities experience, especially women and girls. People with a disability are more likely to be prevented from accessing their basic rights and denied their opportunities to fully participate in society. This results in their social exclusion and marginalisation. Diverse perceptions towards persons with disabilities in various cultures have resulted in different approaches to addressing disability. Historically, in most countries across the world, people with disabilities were viewed as a liability and capable of only surviving with charitable contributions, especially donations from religious institutions. Disability is often linked to an outcome of misdeeds of the disabled person or the family, and persons with disabilities are largely considered objects of charity. In India, belief in karma and the impact of sin and purity shape the way disability continues to be perceived. The charity model of such disability is an outcome of such perceptions. This approach identifies people with disabilities as dependents, incapable of social, economic and political participation, surviving on the benevolence of others. With the advancement in science and medicine in the era of industrialization, another approach has emerged which identifies disability and impairments as a deviation which must be corrected. The medical model or functional limitation model of disability focuses on the impairment or limitation of the individual and the need to cure it for maximizing the ability of the individual to function normally. In 1980, the World Health Organization, under the International Classifications of Impairments, Disabilities and Handicaps, defined impairment as any loss or abnormality of psychological or anatomical structure or function, and disability as a restriction on the lack of ability resulting from an impairment to perform an activity in the manner or within the range considered normal for a human being. It is through rectification of the limitation and provision of skills to overcome such a restriction and assimilate within the mainstream population that this approach looks to rehabilitate people with disabilities. If such rectification is not an option, then the individual is rendered dependent upon medical institutions for lifelong care. The onus of the disability is on the individual and not on society. The rehabilitation for people with disabilities is largely through medical services like doctors, therapists, asylums and hospitals to cure the problem. It may thus be argued that by not accommodating difference and creating support structures within society to enable equal participation, persons with disabilities or impairments are effectively disabled by society, as it is society which increases their marginalisation. Both the charity model and the medical model are criticised for locating disability as a personal tragedy or an individual limitation which requires an action on behalf of the person with disability towards inclusion in society. These models perceive persons with disabilities as dependents and are incapable of self-determination by ignoring their basic rights and focusing on the deficit of the individual. Women with disabilities face multiple discrimination for their gender and disability. For instance, women with a disability are often deprived of determining their reproductive choices and in some cases have been subjected to forced sterilisation. The marginalisation of people with disabilities as an outcome of social, environmental and attitudinal barriers was highlighted by the social model of disability. The social model takes the responsibility of disability away from the person and places it onto society and the environment. The model understands impairment as related to the condition of body or mind, and disability is the barriers created when the society and the environment respond to the impairment. Its focus is on the removal of those barriers in accessing and choosing healthcare, education, employment, and recreation, which will lead to their full inclusion in society. In order to achieve this social change, it is society which will have to find solutions to the barriers. This model focuses on removing the stigma attached to disability by building an understanding that persons with disability are not dependent and passive because of their incapability, but because of the disabling environment. This has led to people with disabilities viewing themselves as individuals who do not have to depend on charity and could demand their rights. Influenced by the civil rights movement and strengthened by the participation or disability activists, this model provided a strong foundation for human rights-based approaches to disability. By the 1970s, growing international awareness regarding the lived consequences of being differently abled and pressure from activists resulted in the UN dedicating a declaration to highlight awareness of the issue. The UN Declaration of Rights of Disabled Persons from 1975 states, "Disabled persons, whatever their origin, nature, seriousness of their handicaps and disabilities, have the same fundamental rights as fellow citizens of the same age. This implies first and foremost the right to enjoy a decent life, as normal and as fully as possible." In the 1980s and 90s, there were crucial periods for the disability rights movement, as there was a sustained effort to use the social model to guide international legal instruments like the Standard Rules on the Equalization of Opportunities for Persons with Disabilities from 1994 and the Vienna Declaration and Programme from Action. However, it is the United Nations' Convention on Rights of Persons with Disability, adopted in 2006, which brought the biggest shift. Before this, people with disabilities were not explicitly given protection by the international human rights regime. The UN Convention, being a convention, is the first international rights instrument applicable to and legally enforceable by individuals on the basis of their disability status. Article 1 of the Convention states, "The purpose of the present Convention is to promote, protect and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities, and to promote respect for their inherent dignity. Persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual or sensory impairments, which, in interaction with various barriers, may hinder their full and effective participation in society and on an equal basis with others. The human rights-based approach to disability is the recognition of each disabled person as an individual who has fundamental rights. Human dignity and equality are at the core of human rights values. Disability is not a homogenous category, and the experiences of people with disabilities varies with different circumstances. This approach acknowledges the impact of intersectional issues on the lives of people with disabilities, especially women and girls in developing countries. This approach also considers impairment as a part of human diversity and not something to necessarily rectify in order to access basic human rights. It is therefore a holistic approach moving beyond the anti-discrimination model to address socio-economic, political, social and cultural rights. The impact of disability on access to education and employment for women and girls with disability is discussed further. With regard to access to education and employment as human rights, globally there are more than 131 million girls that are missing out on basic education, with 32.4 million girls out of primary school and 29.8 million female adolescents out of lower secondary school and 64 million girls out of upper secondary school. Article 24 and 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights highlights the need for employment and education to be accessible to all. In the Indian Constitution, rights to education and equal opportunities in employment are also part of the fundamental rights of all citizens. Despite this, most women and girls, especially those with a disability, are denied access to education and employment, violating their most basic rights. The right to education is considered a human right because literate children have more opportunities to effectively participate in society and alleviate intergenerational poverty. For this reason, education has been called a multiplier right. As with more education, more social opportunities are available to individuals. This includes improved access to employment, freedom from child labour, increased healthcare provision and civic participation. Education, therefore, is not only a fundamental right in itself, but also the means of realising other basic rights. Better education leads to better health indicators, more income and economic growth, and political stability. Unemployment is central to poverty and inequality, especially in developing countries. Decent and productive employment are essential for ensuring economic security and well-being. Disability can cause poverty, and poverty can also lead to disability. Lack of access to basic education for children, especially girls with a disability, is a barrier for them to later earn and participate in society and realise their full potential. Children with a disability are 10 times more likely to not attend school compared to non-disabled children. In India, 69% of the disabled population live in rural areas and have very limited access to basic healthcare, education, and livelihood opportunities. Families play a crucial role in the lives of persons with disabilities, as they are largely dependent on them for survival and support. Due to the stigma around disability, families often conceal the disability or hide the person with disability from society. This leads to their isolation and low self-esteem. The World Programme for Action Concerning Disabled Persons from 1982 states, "The consequences of deficiencies and disablement are particularly serious for women. There are a great many countries where women are subjected to social, cultural, and economic disadvantages which impede their access to, for example, healthcare, education, vocational training, and employment." According to Nilika Mehrotra, gender is one of the major decisive factors in development of a disabled child. Women and girls with a disability are either denied education or drop out from school. Their education is therefore not prioritised, as families do not view them as a productive member of the family or of society and prefer to spend their scarce resources on non-disabled members of the family. Their need for support from their family members is therefore increased, making them more dependent with a higher need to be cared for, as they are less likely to be taught the skills to be more independent and self-reliant. This then reinforces perceptions that persons with disabilities are often seen as a burden. Inaccessible transport systems, classrooms, and infrastructure like toilets restrict women and girls' mobility and often prevents them from being able to leave their households with ease. This is further enforced in the name of protection, especially after girls reach puberty, in order to protect them from potential sexual abuse and violation. However, many women and girls with disability face both sexual and mental abuse within families, especially those with mental and intellectual disabilities. Marriage is not considered an option for women and girls with disability, as they are frequently viewed as a lifelong burden on their natal family, as they have to bear the cost of care. Young women and girls with a disability who are able to overcome challenges to access higher education face more barriers. Even then, they still have to deal with bias in selecting the subjects they want to study, and are largely excluded from science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Inaccessible content and libraries, lack of trained teachers, and the absence of assistive technology for inclusion of persons with disabilities continues to marginalise people from higher education. Further, higher education levels of education are typically situated within urban areas. Access for differently abled persons thus also has the difficulty of relocation and finding accessible accommodation and local support services. In patriarchal societies, Stereotypical gender roles likely restrict women and girls to household chores and child-rearing. Due to a lack of infrastructure and relevant vocational market-aligned skills, training of rural and semi-urban spaces in India results in persons with disabilities being largely unemployed or being paid less than their counterparts, and women with disability earn less than men with disabilities. Women and girls with disabilities seeking employment are discriminated against based on the perception regarding their capabilities as women and as a person with a disability. There is limited awareness about the abilities of persons with disabilities among employers, and they tend to rely on social stereotypes about persons with disabilities as helpless, dependent individuals with a medical condition. These perceptions and lack of awareness influence the employment opportunities for persons with disabilities. Various organisations across India are training persons with disabilities, but their transition from training to placement is very slow, especially for women and girls. This exacerbates the exclusion of ageing women and children with disability. They have very limited access to formal employment or training throughout their lives, which further renders them dependent upon their families for all forms of support, such as healthcare, shelter, and nutrition. Reserved government jobs are the preferred option for most people with disabilities in India, as they provide job security. However, even in these jobs, they face the barriers of low expectations and scarcity of productive work being assigned to them. In both public and private sectors, people with disabilities wait to be recognised as productive employees capable of performing their tasks without help or support if proper infrastructure is provided. Women with disability are also less likely to access loans and engage in self-employment in comparison to men. This lack of access to employment and livelihood opportunities perpetuates the cycle of disability, marginalisation and poverty, as people with disabilities have to incur more healthcare-related costs. It is also important to understand that women and girls with disability are not a homogenous group. Not all women and girls with impairments will have the same experiences and not come from the same socio-economic, religious or caste-based background. They will therefore face different challenges. The challenges of a hearing impaired woman in accessing public transport will of course be very different from that of a visually impaired person or someone who is physically differently abled. Not only are challenges different across disability, but within the same disability as well. A woman with late blindness, for example a woman who becomes blind later in life, may face a different set of barriers in comparison to a woman born blind at birth. Similarly, the challenges of a young woman with disability in accessing education may differ from that of an aging woman. There are numerous provisions for protecting the right to education and employment of women and girls in international and national law. It is in the recognition of the multiple discriminations faced by women and girls with disability in accessing their basic human rights, like access to healthcare, access to education, and access to employment, that various UN conventions and international law instruments have focused on the need to provide better services. These UN documents are often focused on enabling women to access these rights. We will now start to discuss the provisions for women and girls to access education and employment in international and national laws. Affirming support for the World Programme of Action concerning disabled persons from 1982, the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women recommends, in its General Recommendation number 18, that state parties provide information on disabled women in their periodic reports, and on measures taken to deal with their particular situation, including special measures to ensure that they have equal access to education and employment, healthcare services and social security, and to ensure that they can participate in all areas of social and cultural life. The UN Convention for the Rights of People with Disabilities is the first comprehensive international legal instrument exclusively for persons with disability. It aims to protect, promote and ensure full and equal employment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disability. It consists of 50 articles addressing the social, economic, political and cultural rights of persons with disability. The UN Convention, which came into force in 2008, was ratified by India in October 2007. This convention acknowledges the neglect, abuse, and multiple forms of discrimination faced by women and girls with disabilities in accessing basic rights. All of the provisions below relate to education and employment, which are applicable to women and girls. Article 24 of the Convention recognizes the right of persons with disabilities to be included in education and lifelong learning, fulfilled development of human potential, a sense of dignity, respect for human rights and diversity, and participation in a free society. Article 27 recognizes the rights of people with disabilities to work on an equal basis with others and in an environment inclusive and accessible to people with disabilities. It places the obligation on states to make legislation to safeguard and promote rights to work, even for those who acquire a disability during the course of their employment. It prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in employment, protects the rights of people with disabilities to equal opportunities and remuneration, healthy working conditions, and protection from harassment and forced labour. It also promotes labour and trade union rights, continued vocational training and career advancement opportunities, self-employment and entrepreneurship and employment in the public and private sector. It is Article 6 of the UN Convention which specifically focuses on women and girls and highlights the importance of recognizing the discrimination against them and ensuring them access to basic human rights in all provisions of the treaty. Article 6 states that state parties must recognize that women and girls with disabilities are subject to multiple forms of discrimination, and in this regard shall take measures to ensure the full and equal employment by them of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. It also states that women shall take all appropriate measures to ensure their full development, advancement and empowerment of women for the purpose of guaranteeing them the exercise and enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms. The UN Treaty has been ratified by 174 countries across the world, including India. This means these countries have all agreed to be legally bound to the treaty and will align their domestic laws to fulfill the requirements of the Convention. Part 3 of the Constitution of India contains fundamental rights which guarantee certain basic rights to all citizens. The right to education and the right to equal opportunities in employment under this right to equality focuses on providing the basic human rights of access to education and equality of opportunity. These are applicable to all citizens, including people with disabilities. Article 41 of the Constitution notes, "The state shall, within the limits of its economic capacity and development, make effective provision for securing the right to work, education, and to public assistance in cases of unemployment, old age, sickness, disablement, and in other cases of undeserved want." The Persons with Disabilities, Equal Opportunities, Protection of Rights and Full Participation Act for 1995, also known as the Person with Disabilities Act, was an outcome of lobbying by disability groups and mounting international pressure regarding disability rights. Prior to this, the Mental Health Act of 1987 focused on laws relating to the treatment and care of mentally ill persons. The Rehabilitation Council of India Act 1992 for regulating rehabilitation, education and professionals, and the National Trust for the Welfare of Persons with Autism, Cerebral Palsy, Mental Retardation and Multiple Disabilities Act in 1999 provided for constituting boards of national and local trusts and provisions with legal guardianship. The Persons with Disability Act of 1995 was very significant as it contains rights for people with disabilities for equal opportunities and full participation. Chapter 5 and 6 were comprehensive chapters dedicated to the education and employment of people within India. Chapter 5 recognized the need to ensure free education to children with a disability till the age of 18. It states that countries must set up schools, identify schemes and programs for non-formal education like open schools and universities, promote inclusion in mainstream schools, research for design in assistive devices and teaching aids, and development skills and manpower of teachers and comprehensive education schemes to remove barriers for children in infrastructure. Chapter 6 recognises the need for the identification and reservation of 3% of posts for persons with disabilities in public sector jobs and incentivising the private sector employers to ensure 5% of their workforce comprises of people with disabilities. It also promotes the establishment of special employment exchanges, maintenance and inspection of records that people with disabilities are being employed, formulating schemes for ensuring employment, and reserving 3% of seats in educational and poverty alleviation programs for people with disabilities. The PWD Act of 1995 was a significant step in ensuring the rights of persons with disabilities in India. However, in the context of women and girls, it does not provide a specific focus on rights of women and girls with disability, and the need to recognise and respond to the discrimination faced by them on multiple levels is needed. After much deliberation and lobbying to strengthen the existing acts, the Person with Disability Act of 2016 came into force. The number of disabilities listed has increased from 7 to 21, and it now includes acid attack survivors and people who suffer from Parkinson's disease. The Act, in addition to the amendment in reservation by increasing the reserved seats in educational institutions from 3% to 5%, and for jobs in the public sector from 3% to 4%, also focuses much more on accessibility, stressing on rights of women and children, specifying the appropriate government and local authorities shall take measures to ensure that women and children with disabilities are able to enjoy their rights equally with others. The 2016 Act is a step forward for people with disabilities in terms of recognising their rights in India. It identifies more types of disability, focuses on accessibility, and spells out the importance of ensuring women and girls their basic human rights. The work now is to ensure that the rights contained in the Act do not remain in existence only on paper, but are also implemented in reality and are accessed by every person with a disability, especially women and girls, across India as quickly as possible. The conclusion should be that being differently abled is perceived in different ways across cultures, and the perceptions inform the various approaches to disability and vice versa. The charity and medical model focus on the deficit of the individual and the need to rectify the deviance, while the social model located disabilities within the barriers created by society and the environment, and the human rights-based approach moves beyond the anti-discrimination aspect to provide full economic, social, political and cultural rights. Irrespective of the model applied, realizing the basic human rights of women and girls with a disability is a challenge faced by nations across the world. Access to education and employment promise to provide opportunities towards economic and social independence, security and development. Women and girls with a disability are often the most deprived of these human rights. Stereotypes, inaccessible infrastructure, patriarchal mindsets all aggravate the situation, excluding and isolating women and girls from society. There are efforts being made on international and national levels to strengthen the rights of people with disabilities, especially women and girls. Aligning with the United Nations Convention for the Rights of People with Disabilities, the 2016 Act in India focuses on the rights of women and girls and widens the definition of disability to be much more inclusive. These instruments are important as they recognize the hardships faced by women and girls due to the intersection of gender and difference in ability. However, the change in status is possible with the effective implementation of these laws and regular monitoring to ensure women and girls with a disability can exercise their rights to realize their full potential. This, therefore, needs to be the priority for future years. This module is now complete. Thank you.